confirmation battle for Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh continues as both sides dig in and President Trump directly attacks Christine Ford. And that's got several key Republicans upset. Also, new reaction to the Times story saying Donald Trump committed tax fraud. A former federal prosecutor joins us to weigh in. And we'll also shift gears to sports and head out to Yankee Stadium as we check in on tonight's big wild card game between the Yankees and the Oakland A's. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Andrew Whitman, in again for Richard French tonight. Remember when Donald Trump said this on the campaign trail?
As a businessman and real estate developer, I have legally used the tax laws to my benefit and to the benefit of my company, my investors, and my employees. I mean, honestly, I have brilliantly used those laws. I have often said on the campaign trail that I have a fiduciary responsibility to pay no more tax than is legally required, like anybody else. Or, put another way, to pay as little tax as legally possible.
It was an effective line on the campaign trail, and now comments like that are getting new attention in the wake of the New York Times report saying that Trump participated in suspect tax schemes and even outright fraud.
A story President Trump has been telling for decades.
I started with $1 million loan. I built a company that's worth more than $10 billion.
Now called into question by the New York Times. They report Donald Trump's father, Fred, lent him at least $60.7 million. The Times asserting that overall the president received the equivalent today of at least $413 million from his father's real estate company, adding that much of the money came to him through dubious tax schemes, including instances of outright fraud. One of the reporters who conducted the investigation on GMA this morning.
Because we started with a simple question. He'd made around $130 million, and it was just such a juxtaposition from 10 years earlier when the New York Times had published 3 pages of his 1995 tax return where he had logged $1 billion loss.
Their investigation captured in this Showtime documentary.
Fred Trump's estate tax return is in the building right now.
The paper pointing to records that it says show the president helped transfer more than $1 billion of his parents' wealth to himself and his siblings, a sum that they report would have produced a tax bill of at least $550 million. But they say the family employed a variety of tax dodges, cutting that to $52.2 million. In response, President Trump tweeting, they used the concept of time value of money and doing a very old, boring, and often told hit piece on me.
One of Trump's lawyers says the allegations are 100% false and are also defamatory, but the New York State Tax Department is now reviewing the allegations. And for analysis, particularly on the legal aspects of all this, I spoke earlier today with former federal prosecutor Roland Riabel. So the Times claims that it's found some examples of dubious tax schemes that the Trumps participated in during the 90s, including instances of outright fraud. You've done your fair share of federal tax law work in your practice. Just how dubious do you find those Trump family tax schemes, and do you concur with the Times that some of it was outright fraud?
Andrew, some of it does sound, if the Times reporting is accurate, like it could be outright fraud. And the parts of the Times article that sounded particularly dubious to me are the allegation of improper or appraisals. Having an appraisal in year one that values a property very high for the purpose of getting a bank loan, and then having an appraisal on the same property the next year that values it at a tiny fraction of that amount for the purpose of estate tax. That kind of thing really does sound like there is likely to be tax fraud involved. And that, by the way, that overvaluation and undervaluation of real estate properties in this way is a very common type of fraud in the real estate industry. Some of the rest of it sounds more like garden variety wealthy people doing what they can to avoid the estate tax, and is not as dubious, I think, as the Times makes out.
And I want to explore that part of it in just a little bit, but before we get there, Roland,
sure.
What sort of legal jeopardy could the president or his company still be in, and would that be criminal or civil liability?
At this point, Andrew, I think it is very unlikely that the stuff reported in the Times article that relates to financial machinations that were going on 15 or 20 years ago, it's very unlikely any of that could result in a criminal prosecution, because virtually all criminal prosecutions are required to be brought in 5 years, within 5 years of the time the crime is committed, or with respect to tax crimes, within 6 years of the time the crime is committed. So this stuff is very old and unlikely to result in a prosecution, but it could result in taxation, together with penalties and interest, if the IRS or the state tax authorities go back and do find that there is tax due and owing, even on these old returns. And we know from the news reporting that New York State is apparently looking at these issues. So there could be some significant civil liability.
Normally when we call you, Roland, we're calling in relation to the Mueller probe. We know they're looking at Trump's finances, at least in relation to Russia. Would something like this be of interest to Mueller's team? And if so, how and why? And would that be in their final report? This doesn't seem like something that would be impeachable on its own.
I think this stuff is not something that is within the purview of the Mueller probe. If Mueller's people in their investigation have come across evidence of these behaviors, they would refer them out, and probably to the Southern District. Remember, the Southern District has Michael Cohen and Alan Weisselberg on its team of witnesses, and it has all those documents that were obtained from Michael Cohen's office and home. So that would be the natural place for an investigation of Trump's financial legerdemain or tax evasion. And it wouldn't be a Mueller probe issue, I don't believe.
Roland, you said earlier that this is fairly common, or maneuvers like this is more common than you might think among particularly wealthy people. I know, for example, when folks have to put somebody in a nursing home or go to hospice or go to the hospital, they'll often figure out a way to pass on their net worth to their families, because the bills for those things are based on that individual's net worth. So my first reaction to this is something of an inflated version of that on a Trumpian scale. Am I wrong in that assessment?
No, I think a lot of what you see here is that kind of thing. It is what you see happening here is a transfer to Donald Trump and his siblings of as much of his father's wealth as possible before his father's death, in as tax advantageous a way as possible, including the use of these exotic trusts called GRATs and all that kind of thing. This is tax avoidance on a grand scale, which is not uncommon among the extremely wealthy. It may not be something that you'd admire, but it's not necessarily illegal, as long as it's done legitimately. If, however, you appraise Fred Trump's real estate assets at, $500 million the year before he dies, and then for the purpose of his estate at $100 million, that's suspicious, and it may be criminal. But a lot of the rest of it, I think, is more or less routine.
So where was the IRS for all of this, Roland? Why would it take the Times expose to uncover all the stuff that the IRS missed? And should we keep that in mind as we judge the reporting from the Times here, that the IRS never did get involved or never did investigate?
Well, I think the IRS, according to Mr. Trump, he and his dad and everybody else in the Trump family gets audited every year. I don't know whether that's true or not, of course, but keep in mind that the IRS only sees the tax records and probably sees a limited number of business records underlying the tax returns. So if, for example, Donald Trump valued a real estate asset one way for a bank and then valued it another way for a tax return, the IRS might only really have access to or see the second valuation. They might not see these differences that would clue them into the problems. But it does sound like if the Times article is correct, the IRS may have missed a number of issues here.
Final question, Roland. These tax avoidance trusts, you mentioned them before, GRATs. that the Times was drilling down on before. Even the Times said these things are designed to avoid the sting of inheritance tax. How is something legal that is designed to avoid the law or a legal responsibility? How are these things legal, Roland?
Well, it all depends on what's in the IRS code. And, you know, as we know, Andrew, from bitter experience, wealthy people have a great deal of influence on what goes into our legislation in Washington. And they do find ways to have things like grats put into the IRS tax code so that they pay a minimum of estate tax. It's not illegal if it's in the code and you're using it properly. And that's a fact.
It's just amazing. Here's a legal device to let you avoid the law. Roland Riopel, former federal prosecutor, and our go-to man on all these things that are confusing us about the Trump White House. Roland, thank you very much.
A pleasure to be with you, Andrew.
So that's the legal side of the story. Let's talk politics now. And for that, we bring in tonight's panel. Brad Gersman is with us. He's a political consultant and founding partner of Gotham Government Relations. To his left, Dominic Carter, political journalist and author. And on the other side of the table, Scott Vanderhoff, Republican Rockland County executive for 5 terms. He's now co-chairman of the Palisades Institute of Dominican College. Scott is also running for the New York State Senate, but we're not going to be talking about that tonight. I'm terribly sorry. So this Trump story, and I want to start with you, Brad, because it's been the longest since we've seen you here. From a political standpoint, it's probably not going to do him a lot of harm, but it does puncture this image that he's this self-made man. He's a Horatio Alger story with a small $1 million loan from his father. It also kind of punctures just how shrewd a businessman he is, doesn't it?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, it seems, if the New York Times article is correct, that he was not a self-made man. But let's be honest. Who actually thought he was a self-made man anyway? We all knew he came from great wealth, and that he just is a continuation of what his father built in Brooklyn, he did in Manhattan. I don't think anyone in their wildest dreams believed that Donald Trump was a self-made man, he worked hard, but we know where it all came from.
We know that because we've been following Donald Trump for decades, if you around the table, but you go into these rallies that Trump's having all over the country, these campaign rallies, and the screaming crowds that he got last night, he'll get again later this week. You really think they knew that he wasn't a self-made man? Because that's the story he tells, is that he started with nothing except $1 million that he borrowed from his dad and have to pay back with interest.
I don't think they'll care. I mean, you're going back to like those core supporters, I think, in some of the many of the flyover states. Those people don't care. Exactly like Trump himself said, if he walked out to Fifth Avenue and shot somebody, those individuals wouldn't care anyway. They see him as rich, wealthy. He's done things on TV. People think everyone who's on TV is rich. Remember, he's got his TV shows. He's all busy, as a public figure. And so he's a wealthy man. He's done well. He has his own brand. He's created that. Now he's president, and he's doing things that we think we like.
You getting the same sense, Scott, from voters you're talking to?
No, not really, but I mean, but I think Brad's correct. He is worth, what, $3 billion now, so I mean...
So he says. Go ahead and prove it.
Yeah, if it is, or, I mean, it's obviously he's been doing something to raise money, but I think Brad's correct in the sense that I don't think the people really don't focus on it. I think the supporters are kind of blind to all the various machinations, if you will, about the money side.
Dom, you've spent a lot of time talking with Trump. What's this kind of reporting or these questions about how he built his business? Are they going to impact him personally? Are they going to impact his psyche? Is this going to be something that he's just got to be defensively reject through the whole thing? Is this going to hurt him?
Well, I believe, Andrew, they will impact the president's psyche. He pays attention to everything that's going on around him, media-wise. But at the end of the day, I really feel that it's shame on us, the American people, because we had a candidate that absolutely refused to release his taxes, and we said we're sick and tired of conventional politics. We're going to go for a businessman. And Brad is correct when you talk about TV that propped him up. Let's not forget, once a week he was on national TV, you're fired, And so the whole illusion of Donald Trump with a ton of money and owning the casinos. So he just had to be rich, right? Well, and to Brad's other point, the point that me and you talked about last night, Every New Yorker could have told you that Donald Trump does not have nearly as much money as Donald Trump says that he has. But to your point, and you are correct, in many of these battleground states, when he was able to fly in with the Trump helicopter with gold-plated whatever, they believed the message.
And let's not forget, but for his father, Donald Trump has probably nothing or nearly nothing.
Amen.
Fair enough. I mean, you could say that about for his mother also. If it wasn't for his father and his mother, there wouldn't be a Donald Trump. But I get the point that you're making.
Yes, I'm talking about on the money side, not on the biological side.
There is another issue in play with all this, and that's the tax system in general. Because even as I was talking to Roland, this thing that is described as a trust designed to skirt the inheritance laws is perfectly legal. And we get all of these conversations from time to time about reforming the tax code and taking out the loopholes. Scott, these are the loopholes that will never, ever, ever go away. Wealthy people are always going to have a way to get the money out of Uncle Sam's grasp.
Well, let's be fair. There are legal ways to transfer wealth for families, and there are other ways which are not legal or which skirt the law, which, for example, includes suggesting that something you own is half the worth that it really is, or not telling the truth with respect. So, a lot of this relates to what was actually said about the assets and how it was. But trusts are not uncommon for people to try to shield a certain amount of tax.
They're not, Brad. But when you hear Paul Ryan talking about we got to reform the tax code so it can all fit on a postcard and get rid of all these loopholes, and that sounds great. But every time you roll up your sleeves and start digging into it, there's always going to be loopholes because it's the moneyed interests that lobby the tax code and get the loopholes thrown in there.
Look, people in real estate, and again, this may be just a New York anomaly, but people in real estate have the easiest way to avoid taxes legally, pass money down legally in avoidance of inheritance tax. It's just the way it is. And Trump is taking full advantage of it. And something? It's going to sound appalling to those of us who oppose Trump, but to those who support him, it's no big deal. This is like more noise to take down a president that's doing great things for this country and protecting our country and creating new agreements and blah, 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 blah.
I think you're right. That quote we heard from him on the campaign trail where it's smart for me to avoid taxes, I think that resonated with a lot of people because I think people view their taxes,
people hate
taxes that way as
What do you do? Avoid things you hate.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll get to our other top story, the confirmation battle over Judge Brett Kavanaugh. President Trump getting personal, mocking Kavanaugh's accuser, and that's got both Democrats and Republicans upset.